The camera was lev, the lights were bright. And Charles Barkley was laughing. Not the kind of laugh that slips out accidentally. Not the polite, restrained chuckle of a man choosing his words carefully. This was the full Barkley laugh, the kind that fills a television studio from wall to wall, the kind that makes producers in the control room glance at each other with wide eyes, the kind that carries a target inside it. And that Tuesday night in the fall of 2002, the target was Shaquille O'Neal. It had started the way most things on Inside the National Basketball Association started, casually, almost innocently. The panel was breaking down the Los Angeles Lakers' recent stretch of inconsistent play, and Barkley, never a man who reached for diplomacy when a sledgehammer was available, leaned into the microphone with the comfortable authority of someone who had once been the most physical presence in the sport himself. "Shaq is soft," he said. The studio went the specific kind of quiet that only happens when someone says something that everyone in the room knows will be remembered. He gets comfortable. He stops going hard. You put a physical big man on him, a real physical big man, and Shaq starts thinking about his movies. He starts thinking about his music. He stops being a basketball player and starts being a celebrity. And that, Barkley said, gesturing with one large hand toward the camera as if addressing the viewing public directly, is the difference between being great and being the greatest. Kenny Smith shifted slightly in his seat. Ernie Johnson kept his expression carefully neutral, the face of a man who has learned over years of live television to let the moment breathe without interruption. And somewhere across the country, in a hotel room or a film room or a quiet space between the noise of being the most famous basketball player on the planet, Shaquille O'Neal heard every word. Because in 2002, everyone heard what Charles Barkley said. That was simply how it worked. To understand why those words carried the specific weight they did, you have to understand what Charles Barkley meant inside the world of professional basketball. He was not a random commentator. He was not a man guessing from the outside. Charles Barkley had been one of the most dominant power forwards the National Basketball Association had ever produced. He had played from 1984 through 2016 seasons of absolute physical intensity, a man who stood only 6 feet 4 inches tall by official measurement, but played every single night like the basket was personal. He had been named the league's most valuable player in 1993. He had made 11 All-Star appearances. He had represented the United States of America in the 1992 and 1996 Olympic Games. He had been selected as one of the 50 greatest players in the history of the league. When Charles Barkley said a player was soft, it was not talk show noise. It was testimony from someone who had bled for the same game. And Barkley had history with this particular topic. He had watched Shaquille O'Neal arrive in the league in 1992 as a 20-year-old force of nature out of Louisiana State University, and he had respected what he saw. But respect for Barkley was never unconditional. It was recalibrated constantly, held up against the light, measured against what he believed a player should be willing to do at the highest level. And in Barkley's estimation, Shaquille O'Neal had gifts so extraordinary that anything less than total domination on any given night felt like a personal choice, like a man who could lift any weight he wanted simply deciding not to. That friction, that specific tension between unlimited potential and inconsistent effort, was something Barkley had been circling for years. And that night on live television, he stopped circling and landed directly on it. Shaquille O'Neal, at that point in the fall of 2002, was the reigning 3-time National Basketball Association champion. He had led the Los Angeles Lakers to consecutive titles in 2000, 2001, and 2002, a dynasty built on a foundation that was essentially him. He had been named the finals most valuable player all 3 times. He had been the regular season most valuable player in 2000. He was, by almost any objective measure, the most dominant player in professional basketball and had been for several years running. But dominance, as Shaq understood better than most, required constant proof. The court did not care what you had done before. It only asked what you were going to do right now. The Lakers had lost 2 of their last 4 games heading into that week. Small turbulence for any team across a long season, but for a team built around the expectation of absolute dominance, enough to invite the kind of scrutiny that Barkley specialized in delivering. The narrative had been forming in the weeks prior, whispered at first and then spoken more openly in the way narratives gain confidence when they find an audience. The suggestion that perhaps the dynasty was beginning to soften, that perhaps the hunger that had driven 3 straight championships was becoming harder to sustain, that perhaps Shaquille O'Neal, who had done everything the sport asked him to do and more, was beginning to find comfort where he had once found fire. Barkley did not whisper the narrative. He broadcast it in high definition to millions of viewers on a Tuesday night and put his name squarely on it. What happened in the days immediately following was a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of a man who had not heard, the silence of a man who had heard perfectly and was deciding what language to use in his response. Shaq gave an interview the next morning in which he said, with the easy warmth that he deployed so naturally it sometimes made people forget he was also capable of cold precision, that he thought Charles was a wonderful analyst and a great champion, and that he respected everything Charles had accomplished in the game. He said this with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He said it the way a man says something he has decided to say rather than something he feels compelled to say. The reporters who covered the Lakers that week noted that Shaquille O'Neal arrived at practice on Wednesday with a different quality to his movement. There is something that happens to elite athletes when they shift from operating mode into something deeper, something more focused and more dangerous, and the people who spend enough time around them learn to recognize it before any words confirm it. His assistant coaches exchanged quiet looks during warm-ups. Phil Jackson, who had seen enough of the game's greatest players up close to know the difference between an athlete working and an athlete hunting, watched his center move through drills and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. What he was watching was its own communication. The next game on the schedule was Friday night. The Houston Rockets were coming to the Staples Center in Los Angeles, and Yao Ming was coming with them. This detail was not incidental, it was the specific, almost theatrical piece of irony that the basketball universe occasionally offers when it has decided to make a point cleanly. Because if there was one storyline competing with the Shaq dominance narrative heading into that stretch of the season, it was the arrival of Yao Ming in the National Basketball Association. The 7'6" center from Shanghai, China had been selected first overall in the 2002 draft and was generating the kind of global attention that had not been seen in professional basketball since the arrival of Shaquille O'Neal himself a decade earlier. The comparisons were being made openly and without apology. Young, enormous, gifted, arriving with a physical presence the league had never quite seen in that specific package before. The question of how Yao Ming would handle his first encounter with Shaquille O'Neal was not a minor footnote heading into that Friday night. It was the entire headline. But underneath that headline, for anyone paying close enough attention, was the one that actually mattered. Shaquille O'Neal had been called soft on national television by one of the most credible voices in the sport. And now, with cameras and commentary and an entire watching world present, he was walking into the Staples Center with something to say. He did not say it with words. The opening tip of the game was at 7:30 in the evening Pacific time. The Staples Center held approximately 19,000 people, and on that Friday night it was full. Not because the Houston Rockets were a particularly compelling visiting team. Not because of the standings or any playoff implications. The building was full because everyone felt what was coming, even if they could not have articulated exactly what form it would take. There are nights in sport when the air carries a specific charge before the first ball is touched, and this was one of those nights. Shaquille O'Neal caught his first post touch 47 seconds into the first quarter. Yao Ming was behind him, young and physical and unafraid, 7.5 feet of genuine challenger. This was the moment that Barkley had essentially predicted would reveal something unflattering. This was the moment that the narrative said Shaquille O'Neal would choose comfort over conquest. What happened instead was something that the small number of people who were inside professional basketball in that era still describe with a particular reverence when the subject comes up in conversation. It was not simply the bucket, though the bucket came hard and fast and without ceremony, a left shoulder drop into Yao Ming's chest followed by a right-hand finish that barely shook the rim. It was the entire sequence of the first half that followed. The way Shaquille O'Neal played basketball that night was not the performance of a man defending his reputation. It was the performance of a man who had decided to make the argument so overwhelming that the original conversation would feel embarrassing to anyone who had participated in it. He scored 18 points in the first half. He grabbed 9 rebounds. He drew 7 fouls, sending Yao Ming to the bench with 3 fouls before the second quarter was finished. A number that meant the Rockets' coaching staff spent the entire second half managing their young center's foul trouble, rather than using him in the way they had intended. The physical dominance was one dimension of what happened that night. But the more important dimension was the precision. The choices Shaquille O'Neal made on that basketball court were not the choices of a man playing on instinct and physicality. They were the choices of a man who had studied the specific vulnerability of every defender he would face and was executing against that vulnerability with the patience of someone who did not feel the need to hurry. At halftime, the Lakers led by 22 points. The broadcast team, which included commentary being offered at that moment by analysts at multiple competing networks, spent a portion of the halftime break discussing what they were watching in the specific hushed tone that people use when they are not entirely sure they are describing something correctly, because it does not fit the story they had been telling. The second half was more of the same, except louder. Shaq finished the game with 34 points, 16 rebounds, and 5 blocked shots. The Lakers won by 29. Yao Ming finished with 9 points and spent significant portions of the second half on the bench with foul trouble. In the locker room afterward, surrounded by reporters with microphones and cameras and the familiar machinery of post-game coverage, Shaquille O'Neal was asked directly about Charles Barkley's comments from Tuesday night. He smiled. It was the genuine smile this time, the one that reached everywhere it was supposed to reach. The one that made people remember why they liked him, even when they were trying to be skeptical of him. "I heard what Charles said," Shaq told the room, and then he paused for exactly long enough to let the room lean in. "Charles was a great player, one of the greatest, and he knows this game as well as almost anybody who has ever played it." Another pause. The reporters waited. "But I think," Shaq continued, his voice carrying the easy conversational warmth of a man who had already won the argument and knew it, "that after tonight Charles might want to reconsider a few things." The room laughed. The cameras captured the moment, and somewhere in a television studio or a living room, or wherever Charles Barkley was watching that Friday night, those words landed exactly where they were intended to land. The story did not end there. Stories between men like Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley do not end cleanly, because the relationship between them was never simply conflict. It was more complicated and more honest than that. Barkley, whatever else he was not a man who refused accountability. When he was wrong, he said so. When someone proved a point on the floor, he acknowledged it, because that was the only language he had ever really trusted. The court proved things, or it did not. What happened on that Friday night at the Staples Center proved something in the language Barkley had spoken first. The following Tuesday, when Inside the National Basketball Association aired its next live broadcast, Barkley sat in his usual chair and looked at the camera and said what the evidence required him to say. He had called Shaq soft. Shaq had responded on the court, and the only honest thing Barkley could do with that response was receive it the way it had been delivered. Directly, and without looking away. "I said he was soft," Barkley told the camera, and to his credit his voice was steady and unashamed, because there is a specific kind of honor in a man who makes a large claim and then owns what happens when the claim is tested. 34 points, 16 rebounds, 5 blocks, against a 7'6" man who everybody in this building, including me, thought was going to be a problem for Shaq. He paused, shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man recalibrating. Shaq answered, "And that is all I have got to say about that." What passed between Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley in the years that followed was something that resembled, if you squinted at it correctly from the right distance, something like mutual regard. The kind that can only exist between two people who have been genuinely honest with each other, even when the honesty was uncomfortable. Barkley criticized Shaq again over the years. Shaq pushed back at Barkley, sometimes in interviews, sometimes in public, always with the grin that made it clear the conversation was not finished and both parties knew it. They appeared on stages together. They made each other laugh, because what Barkley had done that Tuesday night in the fall of 2002 was not simply an act of dismissal. It was, in its own way, an act of respect. He had held Shaquille O'Neal to the standard that he believed Shaquille O'Neal was capable of. He had refused to let the championships and the fame and the enormous personality become a substitute for the thing that actually mattered, which was showing up fully every night on the court where everything could be tested. And Shaquille O'Neal, on a Friday night in Los Angeles with 19,000 people watching and millions more at home, and the full weight of his own reputation in the balance, had answered in the only language that either man had ever fully believed in. He had played the game. He had played it hard and smart and with a focus that left no room for any competing conversation. He had walked into the Staples Center carrying a criticism that could have diminished him and turned it into something else entirely. He had walked out of that building larger than he had entered, not because of the 34 points, not because of the 16 rebounds or the 5 block shots or the 29-point margin of victory, but because he had been challenged by a man who understood the game completely, and he had not flinched, had not argued, had not reached for excuses or deflection or noise. He had simply gone to work. That, in the end, was the thing about Shaquille O'Neal that made him impossible to dismiss even when someone as credible as Charles Barkley was doing the dismissing. Not the size, not the strength, not the ring collection or the trophy shelf or the commercial empire that would outlast the playing career by decades. It was the willingness to hear the hardest thing anyone could say about him and respond not with words but with the one form of evidence that neither argument nor opinion could touch. The ball went through the net. Again and again and again it went through the net. And the arena had no choice but to believe.